Hello there. Hello, She Reads a Lot, and Evelyn, and I saw one name, Shrink Wrap Media, which is a new name to me. Welcome, Shrink Wrap Media. I was trying so hard to remember that name that I forgot some of the others. Don't Have a Tiff was there, and others. I'm sure you're all there. For those of you who are new, if you are new, Shrink Wrap Media. I sit in front of the fire every day at 5 o'clock and I read to anyone who might like to join us. I don't get to see all the names as they come up because I have the camera turned away from me so that the better camera is filming. And this way I can read and not be distracted by the other stuff that goes on. But I am incredibly happy that the other stuff does go on. One of the joys of this is to create a little group that people that now know each other and like each other, and it's a lovely group, and it's wonderful when you guys chat amongst yourselves and just get to know one another and talk about the book or talk about anything. It's all great. Currently, we are reading The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. We are on reading 38. It's a very good book. It's told from the perspective of the young man, Walter Hartwright. He is telling this story, but he falls in love with Laura Fairley, who is already promised to another man who we discover and are discovering now that we don't like, Sir Percival Glyde. So Walter goes off on a round-the-world trip to, he's a drawer, and he's going to draw plants and animals and flora and fauna on that expedition. So he is taking a break from narrating the story. The story is now being narrated by Laura Fairley's sister, the stepsister. And her name is Marion Holcomb. And this is chapter 8 of her part of telling the story. Welcome to a fireside reading of The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Reading 38, chapter 8. June the 19th. I had only got as far as the top of the stairs when the locking of Laura's door suggested to me the precaution of also locking my own door and keeping the key safely about me while I was out of the room. My journal was already secured with other papers in the table drawer, but my writing materials were left out. These included a seal bearing the common device of two doves drinking out of the same cup, and some sheets of blotting paper which had the impression on them of the closing lines of my writing in these pages traced during the past night. Distorted by the suspicion which had now become a part of myself, even such trifles as these looked too dangerous to be trusted without a guard. Even the locked table drawer seemed to be not sufficiently protected in my absence, until the means of access to it had been carefully secured as well. I found no appearance of anyone having entered the room while I had been talking with Laura. My writing materials, which I had given the servant instructions never to meddle with, were scattered over the table much as usual. The only circumstances in connection with them that at all struck me was that the seal lay tidily in the tray with the pencils and the wax. It was not in my careless habit, I'm sorry to say, to put it there. Neither did I remember putting it there. But as I could not call to mind, on the other hand, where else I had thrown it down, and as I was also doubtful whether I might not for once have laid it mechanically in the right place, I abstained from adding to the perplexity with which the day's events had filled my mind by troubling it afresh about a trifle. I locked the door, put the key in my pocket, and went downstairs. Madame Fosco was alone in the hall looking at the weather glass. Still falling, she said. I am afraid we must expect more rain. Her face was composed again to its customary expression and its customary colour, but the hand with which she pointed to the dial of the weather-glass still trembled. Could she have told her husband already that she had overheard Laura reviling him in my company as a spy? My strong suspicion that she must have told him, my irresistible dread, all the more overpowering from its very vagueness, of the consequences which might follow, my fixed conviction, derived from various little self-betrayals which women notice in each other, that Madame Fosco, in spite of her well-assumed external civility, had not forgiven her niece for innocently standing between her and the legacy of £10,000, all rushed upon my mind together, all impelled me to speak, in the vain hope of using my own influence and my own powers of persuasion for the atonement of Laura's offence. May I trust to your kindness to excuse me, Madame Fosco, if I venture to speak to you on an exceedingly painful subject? She crossed her hands in front of her and bowed her head solemnly, without uttering a word, and without taking her eyes off mine for a moment. When you were so good as to bring me back my handkerchief, I went on, I am very, very much afraid you must have accidentally heard Laura say something which I am unwilling to repeat, and which I will not attempt to defend. I will only venture to say that you have not thought it sufficient importance to be mentioned to the Count. I think it of no importance whatever, said Madame Fosco sharply and suddenly. But, she added, resuming her icy manner in a moment, I have no secrets from my husband, even in trifles. When he noticed just now that I looked distressed, it was my painful duty to tell him why I was distressed, and I frankly acknowledge to you, Miss Holcombe, that I have told him. I was prepared to hear it, and yet she turned me cold all over when she said those words. Let me earnestly entreat you, Madame Fosco, let me earnestly entreat the Count, to make some allowances for the sad position in which my sister is placed. She spoke while she was smarting under the insult and injustice inflicted on her by her husband, and she was not herself when she said those rash words. May I hope that they will be considerately and generously forgiven? Most assuredly, said the Count's voice behind me. He had stolen on us with his noiseless tread and his book in his hand from the library. When Madame Glyde, Lady Glyde, said those hasty words, he went on, she did me an injustice which I lament and forgive. Let us never return to the subject, Miss Holcombe. Let us all comfortably combine to forget it from this moment. You are very kind, I said. You relieve me inexpressibly. I tried to continue, but his eyes were on me. His deadly smile that hides everything was set, hard and unwavering on his broad, smooth face. My distrust of his unfathomable falseness, my sense of my own degradation in stooping to conciliate his wife and himself, so disturbed and confused me that the next words failed on my lips, and I stood there in silence. I beg you on my knees to say no more, Miss Holcombe. I am truly shocked that you should have thought it necessary to say so much. With that polite speech, he took my hand. Oh, how I despise myself! Oh, how little comfort there is even in knowing that I submitted to it for Laura's sake! He took my hand and put it to his poisonous lips. Never did I know all my horror of him till then. That innocent familiarity turned my blood as if it had been the vilest insult that a man could offer me. Yet I hid my disgust from him. I tried to smile, I, who once mercilessly despised deceit in other women, was as false as the worst of them, as false as the Judas whose lips had touched my hand. I could not have maintained my self-degrading self-control. It is all that redeems me in my own estimation to know that I could not. If he had still continued to keep his eyes on my face, his wife's tigerish jealousy came to my rescue and forced his attention away from me the moment he possessed himself of my hand. Her cold blue eyes caught light. Her dull white cheeks flushed into bright color. She looked years younger than her age in an instant. "Count," she said, "your foreign forms of politeness are not understood by English women." "Pardon me, my angel. The best and dearest English woman in the world understands them." With those words, he dropped my hand and quietly raised his wife's hand to his lips in place of it. I ran back up the stairs to take refuge in my own room. If there had been time to think, my thoughts, when I was alone again, would have caused me bitter suffering. But there was no time to think. Happily for the preservation of my calmness and my courage, there was time for nothing but action. The letters to the lawyer and to Mr. Fairley were still to be written, and I sat down at once without a moment's hesitation to devote myself to them. There was no multitude of resources to perplex me. There was absolutely no one to depend on, in the first instance, but myself. Sir Percival had neither friends nor relatives in the neighbourhood whose intercession I could attempt to employ. He was on the coldest terms, in some cases on the worst terms, with the families of his own rank and station who lived near him. We two women had neither father nor brother to come to the house and take our parts. There was no choice but to write those two doubtful letters, or to put Laura in the wrong and myself in the wrong, and to make all peaceable negotiation in the future impossible by secretly escaping from Blackwater Park. Nothing but the most imminent personal peril could justify our taking that second course. The letters must be tried first, and I wrote them. I said nothing to the lawyer about Anne Catherick because, as I had already hinted to Laura, that topic was connected with a mystery which we could not yet explain, and which it would therefore be useless to write about to a professional man. I left my correspondent to attribute Sir Percival's disgraceful conduct, if he pleased, to fresh disputes about money matters, and simply consulted him on the possibility of taking legal proceedings for Laura's protection in the event of her husband's refusal to allow her to leave Blackwater Park for a time and return with me to Limmeridge. I referred him to Mr. Fairley for the details of this last arrangement. I assured him that I wrote with Laura's authority, and I ended by entreating him to act in her name to the utmost extent of his power and with the least possible loss of time. The letter to Mr. Fairley occupied me next. I appealed to him on the terms which I had mentioned to Laura as the most likely to make him bestir himself. I enclosed a copy of my letter to the lawyer to show him how serious the case was, and I represented our removal to Limmeridge as the only compromise which would prevent the danger and distress of Laura's present position from inevitably affecting her uncle as well as herself at no very distant time. When I had done and had sealed and directed the two envelopes, I went back with the letters to Laura's room to show her that they were written. "Has anybody disturbed you?" I asked, when she opened the door to me. "Nobody has knocked," she replied, "but I heard someone in the outer room." "Was it a man or a woman?" "A woman. I heard the rustling of her gown." "A rustling like silk?" "Yes, like silk." Madame Fosco had evidently been watching outside. The mischief she might do by herself was little to be feared, but the mischief she might do as a willing instrument in her husband's hands was too formidable to be overlooked. "What became of the rustling of the gown when you no longer heard it in the anteroom?" I inquired. "Did you hear it go past your wall along the passage?" "Yes, I kept still and listened, and just heard it." "Which way did it go?" "Towards your room." I considered again. The sound had not caught my ears, but I was then deeply absorbed in my letters, and I wrote with a heavy hand and a quill pen, scraping and scratching noisily over the paper. It was more likely that Madame Fosco would hear the scraping of my pen than that I should hear the rustling of her dress. Another reason, if I had not wanted one, for not trusting my letters to the post bag in the hall. Laura saw me thinking. "More difficulties," she said wearily. "More difficulties and more dangers." "No dangers," I replied. "Some little difficulty, perhaps. I am thinking of the safest way of putting my 2 letters into Fanny's hands." "You have really written them, then?" "Oh, Marian, run no risks. Pray, run no risks." No fear. Let me see, what o'clock is it now?" It was 6:15. There would be time for me to get to the village inn and to come back again before dinner. If I waited till the evening, I might find no second opportunity of safely leaving the house. "Keep the key turned in the lock, Laura," I said, "and don't be afraid about me. If you hear any inquiries made, call through the door and say that I am gone out for a walk." "When shall you be back?" "Before dinner, without fail. Courage, my love. By this time tomorrow you will have a clear-headed, trustworthy man acting for your good. Mr. Gilmore's partner is our next best friend to Mr. Gilmore himself." A moment's reflection, as soon as I was alone, convinced me that I had better not appear in my walking dress until I had first discovered what was going on in the lower part of the house. I had not ascertained yet whether Sir Percival was indoors or out. The singing of the canaries in the library and the smell of tobacco smoke that came through the door, which was not closed, told me at once where the Count was. I looked over my shoulder as I passed the doorway and saw, to my surprise, that he was exhibiting the docility of the birds in his most engagingly polite manner to the housekeeper. He must have specially invited her to see them, for she would never have thought of going into the library of her own accord. The man's slightest actions had a purpose of some kind at the bottom of every one of them. What could be his purpose here? It was no time then to make inquiry into his motives. I looked about for Madame Fosco next, and found her following her favourite circle round and round the fish-pond. I was a little doubtful how she would meet me after the outbreak of jealousy of which I had been the cause so short a time since, but her husband had tamed her in the interval, and she now spoke to me with the usual civility. My only object in addressing myself to her was to ascertain if she knew what had become of Sir Percival. I contrived to refer to him indirectly, and after a little fencing on either side, she at last mentioned that he had gone out. "Which of the horses has he taken?" I asked carelessly. "None of them," she replied. "He went away 2 hours since on foot. As I understood it, his object was to make fresh inquiries about the woman named Anne Catherick. He appears to be unreasonably anxious about tracing her. Do you happen to know if she is dangerously mad, Miss Holcomb?" "I do not, Countess." "Are you going in?" "Yes, I think so. I suppose it will soon be time to dress for dinner." We entered the house together. Madame Fosco strolled into the library and closed the door. I went at once to fetch my hat and shawl. Every moment was of importance if I was to get to Fanny at the inn and be back before dinner. When I crossed the hall again, no one was there, and the singing of the birds in the library had ceased. I could not stop to make any fresh investigations. I could only assure myself that the way was clear, and then leave the house with the 2 letters safe in my pocket. On the way to the village, I prepared myself for the possibility of meeting Sir Percival. As long as I had him to deal with alone, I felt certain of not losing my presence of mind. Any woman who is sure of her own wits is a match at any time for a man who is not sure of his own temper. I had no such fear of Sir Percival as I had of the Count. Instead of fluttering, it had composed me to hear of the errand on which he had gone out. While the tracing of Anne Catherick was the great anxiety that occupied him, Laura and I might hope for some cessation of any active persecution at his hands. For our sakes now, as well as for Anne's, I hoped and prayed fervently that she might still escape him. Thank you all for joining me. More tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram for the second part of this chapter. But until then, everyone, please stay very, very well. Good night.